Welcome to Hope One Live, ladies and gentlemen. There have been some high-profile worship leaders and some other leaders who have recently said that they've left the faith of Christianity. And I thought we'd have one of them on tonight, a guy I've known for 30 minutes, but it's been a great 30 minutes. His name is Jon Steingard. And Jon, for many years, was the lead singer of a Christian rock group called 𝗦𝗢𝗕𝗦𝗢𝗔. Now, me being 58 years old, I have to be honest, I hadn't heard of 𝗦𝗢𝗕𝗦𝗢𝗔. When somebody says there's something new in Christian music, I think either Amy Grant or Steven Curtis Chapman has put out a new album. So Jon is new to me, but we've kind of become fast friends just here in the past half hour talking before the show. And we're just going to have a dialogue on how Jon was brought up and why he decided to, at least maybe temporarily, maybe permanently, walk away from Christianity and what he believes now and what that process was. And then we're going to take your questions. So let me bring Jon on right now. Jon, how are you this evening, my friend?
Hey, Frank. How you doing? Thanks for having this conversation with me, man. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's great. I've seen some wonderful conversations that you've had with my friends Sean McDowell and Jonathan McClatchy and Elisa Childers. So you've been talking about this. And one of the things I really love about the way you're doing this is the fact that you're still searching and you're reading and you're investigating. And it's not just like I'm done with that Christian thing and you guys are idiots for believing in Christianity. You're really open to having a conversation. And in fact, just before the show, you were telling me how many different books you've been reading, which is a list a mile long. And it's like you could just keep reading forever if you wanted to.
Yeah, I think I've been what could I do if I could take a year off work or something? Mm-hmm. I definitely feel like in this process, I really truthfully want to get to the bottom of what's real and what's true about reality and, humanity and divinity and all of that. And surprisingly, I feel like the moment that I publicly said that I don't believe in God anymore is the moment that started this journey in a whole new way, where I'm investigating it with a clean slate, sort of. And so it's been an interesting, 4 or 5 months for sure.
In case they don't know, you were brought up in a Christian home. You're the son of a pastor. Your wife's father is a pastor, I believe, as well. I know that must have been difficult to say to them, I'm not a Christian anymore. I don't believe in God anymore. At least I'm agnostic about it at this point. What kind at what point did you think you were a Christian? And then what led you out of it?
Yeah, so I like you said, I grew up in a Christian home. My dad was a pastor, still is a pastor. My wife, a very, very similar upbringing. We have very similar sort of histories in Christianity and very similar baggage, I would say. Mm-hmm. I became a member of 𝗦𝗢𝗕𝗦𝗢𝗕 when I was 20 years old, started touring and, toured full time. I'm 37 now, and I just stopped touring recently. Wow. So it's really my whole life I was steeped in Christianity, not just as someone who went to church, but someone who was intimately involved in church as a pastor's kid and worship leader, and then sort of within Christian music. I don't think that anywhere along that process, I'm not sure I really fully gave space to some of the questions that maybe I had. Especially once I was in 𝗦𝗢𝗕𝗦𝗢𝗕, when you're in a Christian band, you're a professional musician, but you're also a professional Christian. And right. And the stakes are too high for a lot of people to really entertain maybe some of the questions that they have. And I think that was me.
One of the big faults of sort of cultural Christianity is the fact that Christians aren't supposed to ask questions, right?
Right.
We're just supposed to believe, and if you demonstrate any kind of question, it's almost like it's sacrilege. And that's not the way that the Bible talks about it, but somehow we've gotten this idea that it's wrong to ask questions, or it's wrong to have a doubt and say, hey, how do I find an answer to this? Or what is the answer to this? So yeah, I think that's one thing that we need to say to people watching right now, that The Bible tells us to reason. It tells us to test all things. It tells us to get answers for what we believe. And if we don't allow our young people to ask questions, at some point it might become overwhelming. Did it feel like it became overwhelming in your life, Jon? Like you're going, I just can't even ask these questions in church.
You know, it's so difficult to know when I started to be able to articulate it. I think for a lot of people, they may not really consciously think I can't ask these questions. It's just sort of subconsciously understood that like that's not okay. Because no one ever told me it's not okay to ask questions. I just noticed that no one was asking questions, and that when someone sort of became unsure about their faith, they just sort of disappeared, you know? So much of this stuff, I don't think it's intentional. I don't think that, you know, I don't think pastors wake up in the morning and they're like, I better tell people not to question God today. You know what I mean? Like, it's just sort of part of the culture. And I think you're right when you say cultural Christian. I think, you know, I've had a few people tell me, you know, since I've been on this journey, oh, you were just a cultural Christian. And sometimes in the tone, I get the sense that they're sort of insulting me, but I have to find myself agreeing and going like, I think that's actually probably true. Like, I don't know how deep my faith really went. It may have been pretty surface. And you know, that's something I kind of have had to look at and go, you know, that there could be some truth to that.
What was the point in your early life? Did you think you were a Christian? And in your mind at that point, what made you a Christian? Was it just because you adopted your parents' belief system just because on authority? Or what was it that made you say, yeah, I really am a Christian?
Well, I mean, I think when you grow up in something and you're encapsulated in it, you know, like it's your normal, you know. This was actually part of my doubting process is I wondered if I had been raised in a Muslim country or a Muslim home, would I be Muslim? You know, if I was raised in an area where Buddhism or Taoism was more common, you know, would I adhere to those beliefs instead of Christianity? So I do think to a large degree, I was Christian because that was my family and that was my community and that was what I was raised in, and I certainly believed it. And it, you know, there's a lot about Christianity that can bring a lot of good to your life, and so, you know, that you see, you know, various families in the community that you're in, and you have these things that you go to, and there's a lot of benefits from being a Christian, and I think I just sort of, I mean, if I'm being honest, I think I just rolled with it. And I just believed it to be true by default.
Right. Okay. So it wasn't like you had some sort of intellectual awakening where you said, God does exist and Jesus rose from the dead. It was more the fact that you were in it due to the fact that you were in your family from the very beginning.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, when in my late teenage years, I did recognize that there were a lot of people that had these wild transformation, you know, spiritual transformational stories about when they were saved. And I remember being like, oh, I don't really have that. And I remember kind of being jealous of people that had these like sort of wild experiences with the world, and then they were transformed by Jesus. And I'm just like, I'm just sort of here.
Jon, man, you didn't get a testimony, man.
I know. But I do. The closest thing I had to that, I think, is that in my late teenage years, I was really struggling to find purpose and direction. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life.
Right.
And I remember hitting a point where I felt like I am not very good in the driver's seat of my own life. And I remember saying to God, like, if you can do something better with my life than I can do, then I would like to do that. Like I would like you to take control, basically, like Jesus take the wheel type thing. And then, you know, right around that time, I joined Hawk Nelson, and that really gave my life an aim and a direction. And so I very much at the time sort of attributed that to God's, you know, providence and his sort of answering of that prayer. So that was sort of the closest I had to that type of a thing. Yeah.
What was the issue or issues that caused you to say, I don't know if I believe this anymore, or I don't believe it anymore?
Yeah, it was not a single thing for me at all. It was this long drawn out process of details that are sort of like, I wonder about that. You know, I noticed an increasing amount of this us versus them sort of mentality. I remember having this experience where I went to high school. I went to a private school in the elementary school years. I went to like a Christian school. And when I went to a public high school, I legitimately thought these people are Christian. These people are not Christian. I'm going into the lion's den. They're all going to hate me because I'm Christian. And then I got to school and I discovered there's a lot of people that are really wonderful that I really liked. And I remember feeling like there was supposed to be this adversarial thing, which of course, you know,
that's cultural. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which of course is not what Jesus taught at all. But I was sort of surprised to find goodness outside of Christianity. And that was sort of me noticing these various things. And like I said earlier, wondering if I would be a Muslim if I was raised in a Muslim area. You know, there was so many little details. And another one was when the Supreme Court passed legislation legalizing same-sex marriage. I remember having this gut feeling like that was a good thing. And you know, I can't say that I had a lot of friends that were gay, but I had a few, and I had some friends that were gay that wanted to get married, that were in long-term committed loving relationships. And I remember feeling like I don't see how them getting married is a bad thing, but I'm in this culture where, like, if I say that publicly, if I support this publicly, I won't have a job anymore.
Yeah, I get that. It does put you in a certain box almost. Of course,
yeah. And
if somebody in the gay community became a Christian and believed what Jesus taught about marriage, they would be kicked out of that community too. So there is kind of this, you know, us versus them mentality, and I guess it depends upon how you think about it. I heard somebody say this: evangelism is just one beggar showing another beggar where the food is, right? that
Sure.
Nobody's better than another without Jesus. But on the other hand, Jesus did say, I did come to bring a sword, and it's going to divide people.
Yeah.
Now, that's not the intention of why he came,
Sure.
but it's the result of why he came. So there will be divisions based on what he said and whether or not people are going to follow him.
Yeah.
But that's true even with people who have their own secular morality. If you don't agree with them, they might exclude you as well.
Well, and certainly that's not something that is rare these days, right? Like, we're seeing all these cultural phenomena right now where there's lots of different people groups that if you disagree with, they will cut you off all across the spectrum of, you know, the political and belief spectrum.
Or cancel you, yeah.
Yeah, so that's certainly not something that's unique to you know, Christianity. I honestly, it took me a long time to articulate the things that most kept me from believing. Like, once I really accepted that I was genuinely doubting the existence of God, which by the way was not a welcome thought. Like, I think sometimes there's this perception that, you know, run away from Christianity, like, woohoo, I get to go do some sinning. Right. And that wasn't it for me at all. I was pretty horrified, actually, because the idea of God provided me with so much security and comfort, and the idea that I wasn't alone and to lose that was actually not a welcome thing. But as I spent more time studying and learning and trying to figure out, like, what are my actual biggest issues, and I think it comes down to the two biggest ones for me are divine hiddenness and the problem of evil, or the problem of suffering. And I shared with you a little bit before we went on air. I did this documentary in Uganda in early 2019, and I saw some of the most horrible suffering that I've ever seen in my life. And I know I'm a cliche, right? Like, white North American dude goes to Africa and has his, mind blown by what he sees. But it's true. I mean, I saw things that I didn't know. I didn't know how to marry the two ideas of a loving, powerful God and the suffering that I was seeing right in front of me. I didn't know how to make those two things fit. And while I was there and seeing what I saw, I just remember having this feeling of like the only explanation I can think of as to why there is this kind of suffering in the world is that God is not there.
Now, I know you've been since then on that issue, and that issue is emotional for everyone, regardless of what your viewpoint is. But I know you've been reading about this, and I agree. When we see this kind of thing emotionally, it devastates us. And quite frequently, whenever I get a question, as you know, on the issue of evil, I have to stop myself, because if somebody's at their microphone and says, if God, why evil? I'm ready with my philosophical answer.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But I want to stop and say, do you mind if I ask you why you're asking that question? And if they say, well, I'm just intellectually curious, then I give my philosopher answer. But if they say my baby just died last week,
I know
that philosophical answer is not going anywhere, right? That would be annoying.
Yeah.
That person needs a pastor. They don't need a philosopher. But I think that at the end of the day, the first step back to wholeness is for us to understand that God does have a reason, even if we don't know what that reason is, and even if we never figure out what that reason is. Because it seems to me there can't be evil unless there's good, and there can't be good unless there's a standard beyond us, which would mean God's nature. So as my mentor, Dr. 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗕𝗦𝗢, always used to say, he used to say evil doesn't disprove God. It may prove there's a devil out there, but it doesn't disprove God. And so one of the things that, in fact, a friend of mine says, one of the things that convinces me God does exist is evil. Because we wouldn't even know it was evil objectively unless there was a standard of good, but what we mean by good is God's nature. So how would you respond to that kind of argument?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and reading about it. And I mean, before I say anything, I have to say that like my views on all this stuff are it's all a moving target. I mean,
right.
You've dedicated a lot more of your life to this than I have, and I feel like I've been on this crash course, literally crashing, like falling asleep while I'm reading this stuff sometimes.
Right.
Because I'm waking up early before my kids get up and trying to squeeze in a couple hours of reading. But it seems to me that you talked about there being an objective morality, and I've looked at the issue of morality a lot, because on one hand, like the moral argument for God is really compelling, because most people do feel this moral intuition, right? I mean, but then on another hand, I kind of at the moment I have this sense that morality is actually like completely subjective, and
John, if that were the case, then you wouldn't be able to say that what was happening to those kids in Uganda was really wrong.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I feel like I can. So here's how I would look at it. I would say that I have moral intuition because it's beneficial for me to have it. I mean, if you look at everything through the lens of, the evolutionary lens of pleasure and pain, there's really good reasons for me to desire pleasure and to avoid pain. And those are really functional processes, right? And we also live in social groups. So, and we have for a long time, and there's a lot of evidence that along our evolutionary path, that the fact that we're able to sustain social groups the way that we are actually benefited us, over other hominid species. So we have these social groups, and we have these desires to seek pleasure, to avoid pain, and there's a benefit to being a part of a social group where people value the pleasure and avoidance of pain of the other people in the group. And, you could see that developing over a long period of time and being codified in what's sort of known as a morality or an ethic. and I don't. It is completely subjective in that sense, but it's still practically very real. So, like I go to Uganda and I experience this horrible suffering, and I'm not sure there's anything morally objectively wrong about it, but to me, subjectively, it's horrifying. And I don't think that because something is subjective means that it's not real or it doesn't have any meaning. Do you know what I mean?
Well, it might mean something to you, but
Mm-hmm.
if the people that wanted to push those people out of the land did so because it benefited them, how would you adjudicate between them who wanted the land and the people that are now suffering because they were pushed out of their land? How would you say that the developers were wrong and they were right unless there's an objective standard beyond both of them?
You're totally correct. That's absolutely the problem. So it seems to me that you only need objective morality whenever you're trying to hold your moral intuition over someone else, right? Would you say that's fair? Like, that's the purpose of that's the utility of objective morality.
It's the utility, but it seems to me, as Louise Anthony, she was and by the way, for those who are watching, we're just having a conversation.
Yeah.
We're not trying to have a debate.
No, we're cool. We're totally cool.
Yeah, what we're trying to do is just talk about these issues in a little bit deeper way. That's all.
Well, and also for the audience, like, please understand, I push back on Dr. Turek here because I've found a lot of usefulness in when I poke at an issue, sometimes something falls out that I hadn't heard before.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure.
So it's my hope that I learned something here.
Yeah, you read my books, and you're a work in progress. In fact, we're all a work in progress. None of us have it all figured out, quite obviously. We should all be reading, right? But I guess the point I was going to say was that Louise Anthony, who was an atheist debating William Lane Craig a number of years ago, they were talking about objective morality, and she actually admitted something which hurt her case and helped Craig's case, where she, and I'm paraphrasing, she basically said that any argument I try and give that atheism is true is built on weaker premises than the intuition I have that say torturing babies for fun is wrong. I mean, that the intuition that what you saw in Uganda was wrong is so strong that it would take some Herculean evidence to overturn it, to say that atheism was true is really her point.
Right. I see what you're getting at. I just feel like you can experience something really intensely and it could still be subjective. Like, I don't think something's being a super intense experience means it's objective. And I also, like, another element that we could bring in and is this is the sort of Sam Harris approach, and I have some disagreements with Sam Harris on this, but he basically looks at everything through the lens of well-being, and he grounds his sense of morality in the idea of human well-being and flourishing, and he calls that objective. And my sense is that whenever you say good or bad, or you say better or worse, those words only mean something in reference to something else, right? So say you have, someone asks you, like, a car and a horse, which one's better? Well, that question doesn't mean anything unless you know what you need the car for or the horse for. If you want to go from A to B quickly, expeditiously, easily, you choose the car. If you want to participate in a Civil War reenactment, a horse. So
anachronistic. The guy shows up in a Volvo. Yeah, I get it.
Right. That doesn't work. If you've ever seen, those role-playing people, no one's going down the hill at Gettysburg in a Volvo, right?
That's right.
So I feel, with morality, I sort of feel, I mean, at the moment, my perspective is that it's somewhat like that. Like, in order for you to say something is better than something else, you have to have a goal in mind. You have to have
a meaning of life, which is just to go back to what you said earlier, when Sam Harris says well-being, well, he's presupposing that the purpose of life is human well-being. Well, on atheism, why is it human well-being and not roach well-being? Or no well-being?
I don't know. I don't know if Sam is necessarily saying the purpose of life. I think what he is saying is that at least on the issue of morality, provides a grounding for you to say better or worse. You know?
The problem is, though, without purpose, you can't say something's better or worse. Like, you can't say that your quarterback throwing a touchdown is better than your quarterback throwing an interception unless you know what the purpose of the game is.
Right. So that's exactly why I sort of disagree that adequately grounds objective morality. Yes, right. I'm with you there. Yeah.
Basically, what you're saying then is you don't think there's objective morality.
So, again, at the moment, moving target. I feel like I need to say that a lot. I feel like there's a difference between what's philosophically true and what's true in practice. So I think that
What do you mean by that?
Okay, yeah, sure. So I feel like philosophically, my suspicion is that morality is completely subjective. Well, let's just say this. If God is not real, then morality is totally subjective.
We all agree.
Yeah. And so there's enough of a subjective, there's enough overlap between and commonalities between subjective moral intuitions that we all hold that overlap and that commonality provides sort of a practical objectivity. It's not truly objective.
It's either objective or it's not. There's no middle ground. It's either grounded in an object, God's nature, or it's subjective. It's just someone's opinion. I know you're a big fan of C.S. Lewis, so
I am. I love C.S. Lewis.
So when you read Mere Christianity or Abolition of Man, that's really his take on it. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say I think that you're entirely right. It's either subjective or it's objective, and it can't be any sort of middle ground. And that's why I say philosophically, I think morality is subjective. But when there's enough commonality, so for instance, here's a commonality. It's pretty reasonable to assume that every human being, let's just leave out people that are suicidal for a second, if we can do that. Every human being values their own survival, and there are things that are true about what is more advantageous to their own survival than other things. So there are some objective truths about things that are good for you and bad for you, and and those things are things that we all more or less tend to agree on, at least certain things. So like, I prefer not to be murdered. I think most people prefer not to be murdered. So there's enough overlap and commonality on that issue that we can sort of look at that and go like, well, it's almost objectively true that it's immoral. Do you know what I mean? Like,
because it's not. It's either subjective or objective. It's not like you can be halfway objective and halfway subjective.
Okay, so
it still would be a subjective ethic.
Correct.
The problem is.
Let me rephrase that.
Okay, go ahead.
I think that it is technically subjective, but that when it's so shared by so many people, in practice, we can act as if it's objective on certain issues.
Yeah, except when Stalin comes along and says, you know what benefits me the most is for me to kill 20 million people and take their stuff.
Right,
then
and that's a very big problem. Yeah.
And I know you've said you're not a fan of nihilism.
No, it's the worst.
Yeah. We could talk about morality all day, obviously, and we want to cover a couple other issues too.
Sure, yeah.
And then get to questions of people who are watching here.
Yeah.
Let's talk for a second, a little bit, if we could, John, about logic itself.
Sure, yeah.
Because it would seem to me, even if one were to deny objective morality, it's impossible to deny objective logic. Because in order to say I deny objective logic, you'd be using logic.
Right.
So the question is, from an atheistic perspective, and maybe I'm jumping the gun here, John. Would you consider yourself an atheist, an agnostic? What are you now?
I don't know. I'm not good with labels. I don't
forget the label. Let me put it this way.
Sure.
Here's a proposition. God exists. Do you
Yeah.
agree? Do you disagree, or you don't know?
I don't know.
Okay, so you're agnostic. All right, we got that out of the way.
Yeah, I'm not making an active claim that there's no God. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, so if I would ask you a question about logic, you could say, well, I don't know yet.
Yeah.
Right? Unless you have something to...
I have thoughts about it. So I sort of, I have a similar thought with reason as I do with morality. I'm not sure. Like, I watched your discussion with Alex O'Connor on Justin Briley's Unbelievable show, and it was, for anyone who's watching, it's a really good conversation.
Alex is a very, very smart young man. He's good.
Yeah, and I thought that your exchange was actually really constructive and helpful for someone like me because I learned a lot. I watched it like 3 times, and so one of the things I thought that was interesting is you brought up, if your sense of reason is just a product of blind evolution, then how can you trust it? You asked that question. And I thought about that for a long time because I think it's a really valid question. It's a good one. And my sort of answer at the moment is I'm not sure that you can. and so I sort of look at it from the perspective similar to morality, where it's like, okay, everything that I know comes to me through my senses, and then it goes through an interpretive structure because my brain isn't storing raw sense data, right? It's like, I see things, hear things, touch things, and I have to interpret that information somehow. And that interpretive structure is based on a combination of my genetics and my previous experience. Do you think is that fair to say? Well,
and the laws of logic, because you can't know anything without the laws of logic. So,
sure, but like,
as I understand epistemology, which is what we're talking about here, is that, as you said, John, we get data from our senses, and then we use the laws of logic to interpret that data and draw conclusions about the real world external to us.
Sure, but even the laws of logic, our understanding of those laws are something that have to go through that interpretive structure as well, right? In order for us to learn them.
Well, no, we know them as soon as we know, say, anything exists. When we become self-conscious and we know that A is not non-A, and you can't, the law of the excluded middle, you can't both be pregnant, not pregnant. You just intuitively know that.
But do you think that you know that without that knowledge passing through your interpretive structure?
Well, what you're talking about now is Kant's view of how we know things. And the problem with Kant's view is it turns out to be self-defeating, because if he's going to say, here's how you remember Kant, you can't know the real world. That's how he said, because he said, I've got this external sense data, the phenomena, and then when it gets to the noumena, your mind categorizes it in such a way that you can't know the real world. The problem is that if Kant says he can't know the real world, we have to ask a question, and that is, how can he know that about the real world?
Right.
See, he's presupposing that he knows something that he says the rest of us can't know.
Right.
So I don't buy Kant's epistemology.
Well, actually, so in your book, you mentioned I've read both your books recently, and I remember this point because I remember being really interested in Kant's perspective on this. And actually, if you look at, I think it was in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, if I'm remembering correctly. But there's actually a footnote in that part of your book that answers that question. And I clicked on the footnote, and the footnote says Kant would basically, and I'm paraphrasing from my memory here, Kant would basically respond by talking about there's practical reason or practical knowledge?
Critique of Pure Reason was his book. I'd have to look up the footnote myself, since that was 16 years ago.
Yeah, sorry. But so it seemed like you're in the footnote, you were referencing an idea that I had also been pondering, that Kant, maybe, I don't know exactly how he formulated it, but the way that I would think of it is that, like, if all of our knowledge passes through that interpretive structure, in order for us to know anything, we have to interpret, stuff that we're taking in somehow. So in a sense, yes, we can't trust anything that we know, but we do have to actually live our lives. And so you have to sort of act as if it's trustworthy, even if technically you can't know for sure that it is.
Well, it depends on what you mean for sure. There's certain things you can know for sure that you have to exist.
I have a bad habit of saying for sure. Jonathan 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗕𝗦 always gets me on that one. So.
Yeah, I understand. But
yeah.
if people are going to deny, if they're going to say they can't know, I'm going to ask them, how do they know they can't know? Is the point.
Don't.
Well, then you've defeated your position. Then that's the problem.
I'm not sure that I have. I feel like I feel like all of us are operating as if we can trust the knowledge that we have and the things that we take in through our senses, because we have no alternative. We don't practically have the option of just saying, well, I can't trust anything I think, so I'm just gonna, I don't know, sit here and eat Cheetos the rest of my life. Like,
right, but it turns out that we can trust what we think, because obviously, from a practical perspective, you want to bring practicality into it. Every time I eat food, I get healthier. If I eat poison, I don't. So I can draw some conclusions about the real world.
So you've got a pretty good.
What better explains that? And I'm looking for a quote here right now for just a second. What better explains that, theism or atheism? And one of the things that I just discovered this from C.S. Lewis very recently, John, I just want to get your reaction to it, because I know you're a big C.S. Lewis fan.
He's still my favorite.
I can't say anything better than C.S. Lewis. So let me just quote something that he said that I think makes the point better than I certainly could make any point. Here's what he said, and just react to this. It's take a minute to read.
Yeah, that's okay.
He says, suppose there were no intelligence behind the universe. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose. Thought is merely the byproduct of some atoms within my skull. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I can't believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God.
Yeah, I may not be fully understanding the argument, but I think he's painting this as a real duality, and I still think that, I mean, look at it this way. All of us are operating as if what we know is true. But we also know that a lot of people are very wrong about what they know or what they think they know. Right.
Well, in order to know that, you'd have to know something for sure, though. That's the problem.
Sorry. It seems to me, based on what I perceive, that I can more or less act as if that is true. But I agree.
I think Lewis's point is this.
Yeah.
Either our minds were put together by intelligence or they were not. There's no other, right? There's no other other option. Either intelligence or not intelligence. And when he's saying if it's not intelligence, there's no reason to believe anything you think. But if your mind was put together by intelligence, then you have reason to believe in certain things that you can understand. And that is best explained by God. That's his point. Now, it doesn't prove the Christian God, but it seems to disprove the fact that people are trying to say that I can have reason without any kind of God at all, just molecules in motion.
Sure. I'm going to pull a Jonathan 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗕𝗦 on you, and I'm going to say it's not proof, it's potential evidence.
Yeah, that's right.
Jonathan gets me on that one all the time.
Yeah, you're right. In fact, Dr. Geisler used to say this, John, and I think this is a good way of putting it. He would say there's a difference between proof and persuasion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? I mean, you could give a proof that 2 + 2 = 4, and some guy may go, I don't think so. I like 5. I mean, so there is a difference between proof and persuasion.
Yeah, and you sort of touches on this. I actually think intelligent design, and I've had a lot of conversations with Jonathan 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗕𝗦, who's a molecular biologist.
He's watching right now, by the way.
Awesome. Yeah,
he's in the feed. So say something, Jonathan. But anyway.
Yeah. So I was going to say, in talking with him, we've been going around the horn on a lot of the various arguments for God, and I actually think, when you really look at DNA and like, even if you believe in the evolutionary process, we don't really know how that started and where DNA came from. So as far as the arguments for God, I find that to be actually one of the most compelling ones.
Yeah, and you'd agree with Christopher Hitchens on that. Actually, the fine tuning was what Hitchens said.
Sure.
You know,
I consider those two linked.
Yeah,
because they're both sort of an indication of it. It does appear that there is a design at work that's not random. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I think it's much easier to show that God exists than Christianity is true.
Oh, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah. Because see, Christianity relies on historical knowledge, and not everybody has historical knowledge. That's one reason why you have different religious beliefs around the world, at least from an evidence perspective. Not everybody has the same historical knowledge, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of God, creation, I think there are creation's one of the arguments, obviously fine-tuning, moral argument. We've been talking, consciousness, objective moral laws, if they indeed are objective, logical laws, all these things we've been just touching on.
Yeah.
So I think it's much easier to show that God exists than Christianity is true.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. Yep.
Yeah, and so I guess the two steps that we try and take when we're trying to show somebody that we think Christianity is true is God exists, evidence for that, and then Jesus rose from the dead.
Yeah.
How much reading have you done on the second question, Jesus rising from the dead?
A bit. I definitely want to go deeper on it, but I'm familiar with most of the sort of arguments that I've heard with regards to the sort of looking at the Gospels contextually and understanding like the fate of the apostles, for instance. I know that's a big thing for Sean McDowell.
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
and he's studied that a lot. The fact that I haven't read his dissertation yet, but I actually got it. I got a hold of it, so I'm gonna take a deep dive on that one at some point. At the moment, the sort of place that I'm at is I'm open to the idea of there being God, and I'm also open to the idea of Christianity being true. It's just whenever I come back to contemplating that and wondering if I could get back to a place where I believe that, I'm consistently bumping up into the same problem, which is, where is he?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because I think one of the questions that actually apologists don't deal with very often, the hiddenness of God.
Yeah. And I came up in a very charismatic environment. And so there was a heavy emphasis on relationship with Jesus. And I have to admit, I don't think that I learned a lot of like arguments for God, for the existence of God, or evidence of the existence of. I didn't really learn a lot of that growing up. It was a very emotional thing. It was a very experiential thing. And so I don't know if maybe that's part of the reason I feel this way, but I've been asked, what would it take for you to believe again? And I read. There's a couple of stories in the Bible that, if God is real, there's a few of these stories that really bring me a lot of comfort. And, one of them is the story of Jacob wrestling the angel, or wrestling God, and coming away with a blessing and a limp. And I go like, hey, if you're real, like, I'm wrestling with you right now. That's what this is. And so like, I'll take the limp, And then the other story is the story of Thomas. And even when the resurrected Jesus was right in front of his face, he still didn't believe it. He needed something more. And Jesus could have been like, Thomas, you beat it, like he could have, but he was kind to Thomas, and he did say, it would be better if you could believe without needing something more, but he was kind to him anyways. So I think about that, and when I am asked what it would take for me to believe, I feel like I need some encounter, because if God is real, and if Jesus is resurrected, and if he's alive, and if God is still at work today, I want to know about that. I want to experience that. Like, if that was true, how could I be like, I'm not interested?
Sure. Yeah.
You know?
No. Obviously, Christianity, as Lewis famously said, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember it exactly, but he said, "Look, Christianity is either the most important fact in the universe or it's irrelevant. What it can't be is moderately important." Right?
I totally disagree with that.
You do? Why?
Yeah, because I mean, I look at the fact that no culture has ever come up without having some sort of a religious structure.
Mm-hmm.
And it's clear that religion plays a role in society. No society has ever arisen without one.
Here's the issue, though, John. Now you're importing a moral law. You're trying to say Christianity is going to be a good thing, and you just said it was subjective. So
right. But I also said subjective doesn't mean not real. So
well, but it's not good either. It's just someone's opinion. That's the issue.
Okay, then let me say it this way. It seems to me that there's evidence that having religious beliefs can confer benefits, that it can be useful, it can adhere a culture, it can, I mean, I even look at this in church culture. It can really help bring people together and give them support when they need it.
Right, but it seems to me you're presupposing that that's a moral good when you've already said there's no objective morality.
Yeah, correct. I think it's subjectively good. I think that people experience.
But then it's not really good. It's a preference. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
So when I'm talking good and bad, we're talking objectively good, objectively bad, not just my preference for it. Because then Stalin, as we said, can come along and say what's objectively good for me is I kill all you and take all your stuff.
Yeah, and I think people have a preference to be in community and to be supported by each other.
Yes,
and
I agree.
I think that's codified as morality. But I do think that it's subjective. But again, subjective doesn't mean not real.
It means only real in your mind.
Sure, but there's lots of things that are only in my mind that are real, plenty real to me. You know.
Well, they may be real to you, but they're not real to the whole society. And
sure, but
they're not objectively good. That's the issue.
Sure, but pain is something we all experience. If I put my hand on a hot stove, that experience of pain is only in my mind, but it's plenty real to me. It's also plenty real to anyone else who has that same experience. And and there's a commonality of that experience.
Right. So, yeah. And I guess maybe the question is, why is there a commonality? And I think, why is there order in the universe? And why is this a place we can get evidence? And
like biological creatures experience pain, and it's functional because it keeps them from wanting to do that horrible thing again, like put your hand on a stove.
Hey, let's spend a couple of minutes on the hiddenness question because
sure, please, I'd actually
we could talk all day, and we want to get to some questions here, but I think the hiddenness objection is a very good one that needs to be addressed, and I don't think even to my satisfaction it's completely addressed.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah. Let me say a few things about it. First of all, the interesting thing is that the Bible agrees with this. If you read the Psalms, if you read Isaiah, if you read Job, all they keep doing is go, "Where are you?" Right?
Yeah.
So it's like the Bible's admitting. In fact, Isaiah says, "You are a God that hides yourself." You hides yourself, right? So that's certainly the case. Also, I'd say I think that the evidence or the arguments we have for God, cosmological, teleological, moral, transcendent, the logic stuff, if the resurrection happened, that would be evidence as well, right? All these evidences for God are not negated by divine hiddenness, right? Because God is hidden doesn't mean, well, all these other arguments don't work then.
Yeah,
so
I agree
our
with
question is, really, God still might exist, but my question is, why doesn't he show up more? Is really kind of the question. And I remember in fact, Philip Yancey brought this up, and he was referring back, I read this years ago, he was referring back to a Søren Kierkegaard point. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher.
I love Kierkegaard.
Yeah, and he said, and I pronounce it like Geisler did. Maybe he didn't pronounce it right.
I'm sure you're pronouncing it. I'm sure you're saying it right, and I'm saying it wrong.
No, you probably got it right, because you know what Geisler always used to say too? He used to say this. People would say, "What about St. Augustine?" And he would go, St. Augustine's in Florida, St. Augustine is in heaven. You know?
Yeah.
He'd say stuff like that, you know.
Yeah.
But I don't know where he got this pronunciation. But anyway, Kierkegaard, whatever. He said this. He said, imagine and I'm paraphrasing his story, but imagine a prince of an area in ancient times sees a beautiful peasant girl under his jurisdiction. He sees her, he immediately falls in love with her. Now he's royalty. He's not supposed to marry a peasant, right? So he goes to his father and he says to the king, I love this girl, I want to marry her. Dad, what do I do? And the king says, son, the only way you are going to be able to marry this woman and her marry you for who you are and not the power that you have is for you to renounce the throne, go into her village as a peasant and win her as a peer. If you don't do that, she might just, if you go down to her with your trumpets and your chariots and, you know, all the fanfare of being the prince, she may just fall for the power and the benefits of being, you know, the future queen, right? So he actually renounces the throne. He becomes a peasant. He goes into her village and he wins her as a peer. And then it's a peer relationship. They can love one another for who they are, not because of any power that either one of them might have. And this is why Kierkegaard says this is what Jesus did for us. He left his throne in heaven, he came down to earth, and he became one of us and won us as a peer. If he were to continually display his power over and over again, we might just bow to his power rather than have a love relationship with him. And so it seems to me there's some truth to that. It doesn't answer the objection completely. Sure. But it seems to me, and C.S. Lewis, of course, made the same point in Screwtape Letters. He said, if there's one thing that God can't do is overpower. You know, he can woo, but he cannot ravish. Because if he continued to be in our presence, we wouldn't really have a love relationship. We'd have a king serf relationship. And that's not the kind of relationship God wants. God doesn't want intellectual assent. He wants a relationship whereby there's freedom on both sides. Does that resonate with you?
No, that does make sense. Can I tell a very, very brief sort of allegory, sort of that'll give you an idea of my perspective of this issue?
Sure. Yeah.
So, you know, we were talking before the show about, you know, I've got two kids. My son is 3, my daughter's 2, and I really want to have a good relationship with them as they grow older and they turn into adults. And, you know, by the time my son's an adult, he's going to have the ability to make up his own mind. He's going to have the ability to make his own choices. He's going to be able to say, you know, peace, Dad, I don't want anything to do with you. I mean, I really hope he doesn't do that, but he will have the freedom to do that. But one thing he will never do is doubt that I'm there. Because I am present in his life. And it seems to me that, like, God could be present in our lives in the same way, in a more practical, like, conversational way, the way that you and I are talking right now, the relationship that I have with my son. I don't see why that's not possible. And
I think you're right. It certainly is possible. The question is, why doesn't God do that more often? Because if Christianity is true, he has done that. Right?
Sure. And that's sort of my question, where I go like if my son grew up to be an adult and even questioned, like, you know, I don't know if my dad is real. If that was a question that could even come up in his mind, then I have been so absent in his life as a father that something is not right. And if my son grew up to question my very existence, is that because he's done something wrong or I have? And that's sort of part of how I look at the divine hiddenness thing. Like I had this other experience where I took my daughter to the beach, and it was just me and my daughter, and this was when she was just learning to walk, and she was toddling down the the sand and falling over a bunch of times. And she loved to like play in the waves, but we live in California. There's some big waves. They're way too big for her. And so it was this beautiful sunset. It was just like cinema moment, right? Like movie moment. And she reaches up and she wants to play in the waves, but she's scared. And she reaches up with her hand and just says, please. Like she wants me to hold her hand. And I bawled. Because I was like, right there, that's how I feel. Like if God is real and if he wants a relationship with me, then I want one with him too.
Okay. Now here's the question though, Jon, because millions, I guess billions of people around the world have a relationship with God, despite the fact that he doesn't do it the way you want him to do it. And frankly, between you and me, I wish God did it that way too, right? Yeah. But maybe there are reasons he doesn't do it that way. One is Kierkegaard's reason, right?
Yeah.
And another is, if God did that with everybody, what would we have to do here, right? I mean, God gives us a mission to go out and bring others to Christ and grow in Christ. And if God was showing up all the time and never gave us any space, we wouldn't really be free to actually either pursue him or to reject him.
I don't know. I think that basically what that sounds like is that God hid himself so that we would have something to do. And if that means that some people go to hell, so be it. That's kind of what that sounds like.
Well, I guess the rejoinder to that would have to be that since God wants all to be saved and he loves people more than us, anybody who truly wants to be saved will be saved. That God will get them the information they need. I mean, there are very credible sources coming out of Muslim countries where Jesus is appearing to people in dreams and visions who can't get the gospel any other way. I mean, this is not just one or two stories. There are hundreds of these that are coming out of Muslim lands. So
maybe
I really resonate.
Maybe I need to go there.
Here. What's that?
I said maybe I need to go there.
Yeah, maybe become a Muslim. No,
it's a pit stop.
Yeah, I resonate with the objection because I've asked that question myself several times. I think there is a limit to our ability, however, to liken our relationship to our earthly fathers to our heavenly Father. And he's an infinite being, quite obviously, and he has reasons we don't know about. And as I said earlier, just because we say, it's kind of like divine psychology. If I was God, I'd do it this way.
Right.
And we might not be able to know, we don't know all the reasons why God does what he does, if in fact he does exist. And as I said earlier, I think those other arguments stand whether the hiddenness thing is answered or not. You still have to deal with those other arguments for God in that regard. But let me say one other thing that I think, go back to your analogy of the father-son. Let's suppose that a father, God forbid, dies. He's gone, right? And the son, even if he's never met his father, still knows that he had a father. Mm-hmm. Why? Because he's an effect of the father. And that's how we know God exists. We know God by his effects. We see a creation. We know there must be a creator. We see design. There must be a designer. We have a moral law written on our hearts. There must be a moral lawgiver. And this is what we do. We reason from effect to cause. Mm-hmm. And if there is no effect, then there doesn't need to be a cause. But if there is an effect, there needs to be a cause. And as you know, the books you've been reading, the Christian books anyway, will talk about this, that we know God by his effects. And if space, time, and matter had a beginning, as even atheists are suggesting, then whatever caused space, time, and matter, it seems, must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, and intelligent. So it's almost like we're asking to see a physical God when God is not physical. He's an immaterial being. Now, can he manifest himself in the physical? He did with Jesus, quite obviously. But we're knowing God by his effects, regardless of the fact that we don't see him physically.
Yeah, and I see, the thing that I feel about that is mm-hmm. that if you already have a belief in God, mm-hmm. I think all of that is extremely compelling. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I think if you lack that initial sort of gut feeling, mm-hmm. then sometimes, like when I'm considering all of those things, sometimes I find myself teetering. Like I find myself like, well, intellectually being like, well, some of those are some pretty good arguments.
Yep.
And then I come back to my experience, which is what I think everyone does, because like we can have intellectual conversations, but then when we go and live our lives in the real world, so much of the way we live our lives is based on our previous experience, right? And so there's this experiential element where the experiential element sort of always draws me back to this divine hiddenness problem, where I'm like, okay, like some of these arguments seem pretty good, but like where is God here now? And I realize that you've already but I think experientially it can be a real problem for people like me,
Yeah, I agree. I think it's more of an emotional need or want than it is. I mean, intellectually, quite obviously, Christianity could be completely true, and God has never shown up since he resurrected. I mean, that's quite possible, right?
It is, yeah.
It could still be true. We might not like that. We might say, hey, we emotionally want more than that, and that's why he said, I'll send the Comforter. Now you say, was the Comforter real? Am I making that up in my mind? Yeah, okay, I get that.
I wonder about that all the time because I grew up in a very, like I said, a very charismatic environment.
Right.
So there's this emphasis on the Holy Spirit, and I have many times wondered, like, how do you tell the difference between the Holy Spirit and your subconscious? Like, because I've had so many people say, like, oh, the Holy Spirit told me, and I've also experienced times where, like, a thought just pops into my head and I'm like, I don't know where that thought came from. And
that's right.
Like writing music, for instance, is such a creative process. And sometimes in that process, you get the sense that you're not creating something, you're discovering it. Right. And it's
that's
like,
right. That's right. Yeah.
Where does that come from?
Well, let me make one statement, and then I want to ask you a final question, and we're going to go to questions from everybody else. And that's this. It seems to me, Jon, see how you react to this, that for atheism to be true, every single miracle claim in the history of the world and every single spiritual experience in the history of the world has to be false. Now, is that possible? Yeah, I think it's possible, but is it reasonable? Doesn't seem reasonable to me.
I don't know how to answer that one.
How does it strike you? I don't mean answer it. I mean,
sure.
How does it strike you?
I mean, it depends what you mean by false.
Not true. It was invented in somebody's mind. The miracle claim was invented. The spiritual experience was invented.
Sure. So, I mean, here's a question. So here's part of how I would think about this. Well, first off, I don't know, and I actually think there's a lot of mystical experiences, which I think is what they call them in psychology, that are really well documented. So I can't dismiss them, entirely. Right. I do wonder where the boundary is between psychology and spirituality. Sometimes I have a hard time ascertaining what's what in that space.
Right.
And then the other thing is here's a question. If you don't feel well and someone gives you a pill and they say it's medicine and you take it and you feel better, but then they tell you, hey, it was actually just a placebo, a sugar pill.
Right.
Well, in that case, was the pill helpful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the answer is kind of yeah. And like, so then you would say, was the pill medicine? And so you would say, well, not technically, but it had an effect, or it was involved in a process that created an effect that had a benefit. Mm-hmm. So I look at some of these sort of miracle claims like that. I'm like, I don't know about the veracity of some of these things, but when someone is sick and they get better, and my sister in her 20s was diagnosed with cancer and went through this horrible, and she was pregnant with her first child too.
Oh, wow.
And they started chemo while she was pregnant, which I didn't even know you could do.
Is she okay now?
Yeah, she fully recovered. She's had that. She had that child and 3 more.
Oh, all right, great.
And
praise God, Jon. Praise God.
See, here's the thing. She was absolutely covered in prayer by her entire community. by our, my family's church. She also did chemotherapy and radiation, and she recovered, and she's totally cancer free. And so you could say that's a miracle. And I have no way of knowing how much of a spiritual element there was to that.
Right.
But I'll take it. Right?
Right. No, all I'm saying is it seems to strain credulity to say that every single spiritual experience and miracle claim in history of the world has been mistaken. It just...
Well, it also strains credulity to me to believe that 99% of this chair is empty space. But it actually is true.
I don't even know if that's true, because I paid like $200 for this chair. I hope it's not all empty space.
You got ripped off, Frank. It's almost entirely empty space.
All right, we're about to go to questions, ladies and gentlemen. So put a big question in big block letters in the feed, either in Facebook or here on YouTube. For John, question for me, question for both. That's fine. If you want to super chat us, we'll try and get to your question first. Here's the last question, John, unless more come up during the Q&A.
Sure, yeah.
And I know your answer to because I've heard you say it, like, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? I think you've already said you're open. Yes, you would.
Oh, yeah.
But my question is, what would you need to see in terms of evidence, if you think evidence would push you over the edge? Maybe it wouldn't, in order for you to become a Christian?
Yeah. So I've thought about this one a lot, and when you talk about the arguments for God, that kind of gets you to deism, and then you've already, like you've said already, that there's some additional steps to get to Christianity specifically, or theism and then Christianity. I feel like textual evidence doesn't carry the sort of weight for me that it maybe does for some people. I feel like if God is real, I want some sort of experience or encounter that convinces me. And I know, sometimes I think about the parable of interestingly enough, a man named Lazarus who went to heaven, and there was the rich man that went to hell, and the rich man saying basically, like, go tell my brothers or my friends. I can't remember who it was. He was saying, go tell them that this is real. And I can't remember if it was God or Jesus or whoever says that basically, like, we've already sent them Moses and the prophets. Right.
Even if somebody rises from the dead, they won't believe. Yeah.
Right. And I have a hard time with that, because I'm like, well, if I experienced things that really, like, threw God in my face, I wouldn't ignore them.
Well, you might, maybe you won't, but many people in biblical times did. In fact, Caiaphas, after seeing Lazarus risen from the dead, the other Lazarus, he wants to kill Jesus, and Lazarus. He says it's better that one innocent man die than all of Israel go down. So it's odd when you look at it that miracles in the Bible actually didn't always have the intended effect, or didn't always have the expected effect, I should say.
And it's weird too, because in the Synoptic Gospels, it seems like Jesus is almost saying, like, don't tell anyone at times.
Yeah, I think that was before he wanted to be discovered as being the Messiah. He wanted to have enough time to actually do his ministry before they killed him. So I think that's why he's saying that.
It seems like in the Gospel of John, he sort of always indicated go and tell people.
Yeah, well, John has taken more of the private conversations that Jesus had, whereas the other three Gospels are dealing more with the public ministry. There's some public in John, but it's the private conversations of John. Nicodemus, the woman at the well, those are all private conversations. In fact, the woman at the well, he says, I am the Messiah. But it's private. It's just he and the woman.
Right. I actually had never heard that perspective before, that the John stuff is more private, and that would maybe somewhat explain why it's so different in tone.
It is. And also, as you know, with his disciples, he's with his disciples a lot. He's just with them, teaching them. So it's much more private than it is public.
Interesting. I hadn't heard that perspective before. I'll be thinking about that.
Good. Well, let's take some questions, and we'll bring the great Jorge Gill on. who makes all this stuff happen with the great Jorge Gil. There he is, right there, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, first, fellas, I want to ask about the divine hiddenness problem of George hiddenness, because I've been sitting back here for hours waiting to be revealed. Okay, I played a sad vibe. I wanted to be part of the broadcast, but let's go ahead on and do this. I actually want to thank the people who've been sending super chats. We had great super chats here, and I want to just go ahead on and honor that. First, we had, where are the super chats? Where did they go, man? Because we're having problems with Google Drive, and we couldn't pull up all the things here. So we're going to honor the questions on the super chat, but I want to make sure that we thank everybody. Bamster said, thank you for straightening my face. We'll have you in my prayers, John. That's what he said. Then we have a few questions here from the super chats and the stars on Facebook. Let's see. We have David Luis sent 200 stars. Armin Gregorian, he always send his stars. And now we're going to go to the first questions. Cranman Photo Cinema sent $4.99, and he says, do your intuitions tell you that some things really are objectively right and wrong? If so, how do you ground this morality? And that would be for you, John.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of touched on that. I think that we definitely all have moral intuitions. Things that we feel in our gut are right and wrong. I think, Frank's position is clearly that comes objective moral law that's sort of provided by God and implanted in us. Or implanted's a weird word, but I think that would be your view, Frank. And my view at the moment is that I feel like that can be sufficiently explained by evolution and by our subjective desires having common overlaps, enough so that we have commonalities in our subjective perception of moral intuition, and that it almost appears objective at times.
Okay, so just so people are clear, John is saying there is no objective morality, that it's subjective, just to be clear. Correct me, John, just because that's what you said earlier in the show. Somebody probably put that question in and came in late, so we've already kind of talked about that.
We've talked about that. So if you're watching this later, everyone, you can kind of go back to our discussion on that part. Yeah.
Right. All right. I have Dominic ask, would it help to distinguish between reason pertaining to what is known about the actual world, like first principles and logic, and what pertains to validity? And that's where the question where the question ends. I don't know if I have anything else to go on. Frank, do you understand
sure what
that?
That question is? Say it one more time, and if I can't understand it and John can't either,
it's probably my accent, man. Too much swag in my accent. That's probably what it is.
I think Let me try. Shave, man. I can't hear you through that beard.
Oh, come on, man. This is my windscreen. It's built-in windscreen, baby.
Oh, it's your pop filter.
Yeah, pop filter. So, would it help to distinguish between reason pertaining to what is known about the actual world via first principles and logic, and what pertains to validity?
I don't know that I totally grasp the question.
Yeah, I don't.
I think maybe he's saying that there are first principles that we know intuitively, and then other data that we get from our senses, we have to use those first principles of logic and put them maybe in our minds in a systematic form to figure out if our conclusions are valid. Are our premises true and our conclusions valid? He may be saying that. Yeah, there is a difference between what you know, what's self-evident, and what you learn from your senses, and then you apply those objective laws of logic to the sense data to come up with conclusions about the real world. Maybe that's what he's saying.
I do think that our understanding of the laws of logic are predicated upon a body of experience that we accumulate over time. Like I don't think that we're born understanding the law of non-contradiction, for instance. I think that we observe enough things over time and we notice, something can't be and also not be. And then eventually we articulate that in language as the law of non-contradiction. But it comes from we have a body of experience and we begin to abstract out some of the commonalities, and we start to notice that things tend to be true consistently.
That's how we discover the laws of logic, but the existence of the laws of logic exist independent of us knowing them.
The grounding. Yeah. Well, now I want to segue into this other question by Dominic as well, as another super chat. And he says that he's led to believe that you, John, would get a lot out of the book Christian Apologetics and Philosophy of Religion by Geisler. He says especially covering Thomistic epistemology. And that's pretty much where he was going with the first question. So Dominic,
Thomistic epistemology?
Thomistic epistemology, that one right there.
I'm not familiar with the term Thomistic.
Yeah, it's just from the tradition of Thomas Aquinas, Aristotelian Thomistic.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. It's my accent, man. Again, man, I just have to soften it up.
I got you.
Actually, John is very well read, ladies and gentlemen. He's reading a lot of books. This is the first book, well, not the first book I ever read, because I read the Josh McDowell books before, but this is the first book I ever read by Norman Geisler when I came to seminary. There's some deep water in this book, but this book really goes through the major philosophical viewpoints of how we know what we know, and it arrives at what we would call realism, the objective laws out there that we can know. And that's where he talks about so many self-defeating philosophies like Kant and others. So it's a very, very, very good book. It takes a little bit of work to get through, but it's worth doing.
I've added 4 or 5 books to my to-read list in this conversation.
I'm telling you, man, you're gonna need super chats like us. Like that's how we get all those books for Frank. Now we have another one here by Kyle. It says, your videos have increased my faith and given me more confidence in giving an answer for the hope that I have. Thank you. And your team says 𝗦𝗘𝗕𝗦𝗢𝗕. Now Charles says, what do you think about Reformed epistemology? And this is for John and Frank. Can belief in God be properly basic? And Frank, maybe you want to unpack that a little bit?
I think it depends on what they mean by basic. And I'm not an expert in this area. This is not a presup question. This is a Reformed epistemology question. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, coming from Plantinga's
it's more of a Plantinga view, and I'm not a big student of Plantinga. I've read a book or two of his, so I haven't read it enough to have a real strong opinion on it, Jorge, to tell you the truth.
I've read a little bit of Plantinga, and my experience reading his work is always that, wow, this guy's way smarter than me. And
True.
and I usually feel like I understand about 20% of it, so I don't think that I'm qualified to make any comments on this either.
I will say this. I think Paul is right in Romans 1 when he says that we have an intuitive sense there's a creator, that God's invisible qualities are clearly seen from what has been made. And that's basically natural theology, that we're reasoning from effect to cause, that there's this effect known as creation and we reason back to a creator. Now, that, again, doesn't prove Christianity, but it does prove a being that could be the Christian God. Yeah. It proves that there's a creator out there.
Well, to offshoot off that, like, it does seem to me that if you look at a lot of religions that talk about deities, and so, most religions have a god or gods, historically, and it does seem to be abstractions that a lot of the ideas of these gods are abstractions of things that people experience, and then they sort of project whether it's an ideal or maybe it's like a horrifying, angry god, and often it seems that it's out of a desire to explain our circumstances. And, so you the Greeks, for instance, like the god of war, it's like, well, war is this like mighty, terrible thing. And there must be, if there's warriors, there must be the greatest warrior. There must be the warrior.
Right. But they understood those beings as being inside the universe. Like
I think and they also, they believed in, did the Greeks believe in the 3-tiered universe?
I don't know if they did. That's a good question. But I know that Zeus and Thor and all these gods were creatures inside the universe, whereas Yahweh is a being that transcends the universe and created and sustains the universe, including if Zeus exists, Zeus or Thor and all these. That's why it's And as we talked about earlier, I think maybe it's before we did the show, that Richard Dawkins doesn't really quite understand the difference between Zeus and Yahweh.
Yeah,
they're
I
completely
agree with
different
you
categories.
I agree with you that Dawkins tends to, in my opinion, not approach Christianity super accurately or yeah.
In the words of 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗜𝗓, he doesn't know the difference between metaphysics and 𝗦𝗨𝗕𝗦𝗧.
Yeah.
Anyways, I got another question here for you, John. And 𝗦𝗕𝗓𝗓𝗓 asks, is it fair to surmise that your struggle lies in the application of faith in the real world, and that is what you're basing the entirety of your beliefs? Is that struggle, that applied faith in what's going on around you, problem of suffering, problem of pain, and the like?
Could you read that again?
I can read it again, man. We're gonna have Frank just fire me and hire somebody that speaks better English.
No,
man.
it's not your accent.
Okay, I'm gonna play the violin again. Okay,
no,
hold on.
I'm just trying to make sure I understand the question.
Yeah, I'm just playing. Is it fair to surmise that your struggle lies in the application of faith in the real world, and that is what you are basing the entirety of your belief on?
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I feel like whenever I'm approaching Christianity intellectually, I feel like I can go around the horn and go like, okay, well, maybe this or maybe that. But yes, I think the question is hitting on a good point, where if I ever contemplate bringing it on home, like rounding third base and coming home, I always come back to very experiential problems. So yeah, I think in a sense that is right. Yeah. I'm not sure that totally answered the question, but that's what I got.
Yeah. Okay. I got guys over here in the chat saying that I have reggaeton accent, man. You haven't seen me freestyle yet. Maybe me and John, we can do a collab maybe one day.
Do you see this question from Cranman Photo Cinema?
Let me see. That's a super chat, right? I believe.
Yeah, you see that?
Okay, they pop up over here. It says, John, there is no objective answer to whether child molestation is wrong.
Okay, so I've heard this one. I do feel like what happens when we get into these conversations about moral subjectivity or moral objectivity is that a moral objectivist will pose a question like that, which is so emotionally charged that it basically makes me feel and look like a horrible person if I say that I don't think it's objectively wrong. It feels to me like an emotional appeal to try and convince me that I'm a bad person if I say that. I think that my feeling on that is that something, like I've said earlier, something can be subjective and still be very real and be very impactful in life. And so I would say that I think my feeling that, harming children is wrong, I suspect that it's subjective, but I hold it really strongly. Do you know what I mean?
Like, this is one thing I don't really understand in your position.
Sure,
because
please poke back at me.
It seems so obvious that it's objectively morally wrong. Why would you suggest it's subjective when it seems so obvious it's objective? Why? I don't get it.
I think if there is no God, it can't be objective.
Right, I know, but you've already said there is reasonable arguments for God, whether it's the fine-tuning or the kalam or other arguments. So why wouldn't you say, well, this is just another argument for God? I might not know who this God is, but why? I mean, this doesn't get you all the way to Christianity again. This just gets you to God. So why would you go against your deepest intuition that child molestation is wrong? Why would you go against that when you even have other evidence that this being might exist?
Well, I think I somewhat come back to your our discussion on reason, that it's impossible for me to get out of my own head, right? So
But no, I don't think that's true. I think we do get out of our own head. Otherwise, you and I couldn't even have this conversation.
Well, no, I don't think that that's true. I think that I live my entire life inside my own head, and so do you. And we have enough.
No, I'm learning something about your head right now, and you're learning something about my head by having this conversation. We don't live in our own heads.
Sure, but that's language, and we're passing information back and forth.
Right. So we can get outside of our heads, right? Maybe I misunderstood what you meant by outside of your own head. What do you mean by that?
I guess what I mean is that I'm only capable of experiencing things from my perspective. I can make educated guesses on what things might feel like for you, but I don't know. I can't experience them. So for instance, like I have no way of knowing if when I see the color yellow, my experience of seeing the color yellow, I can't ever know for sure if your experience of the color yellow is the same as mine. I can't know.
You can.
It's not possible.
Yeah, no, it is possible, because that's called the universal. When we both look at yellow and we both go, that's yellow, we're both admitting we're seeing the same thing.
Correct. We're both admitting when we take in the color yellow, it has a specific wavelength. That's that's something that's true. And we all agree that when we take in light at that wavelength, we call that yellow. But my experience of what that is like is subjective. So
it's in the subject, but that doesn't mean that yellow's subjective. Just because everything you know is in you, the subject, but that doesn't mean the things you're knowing are subjective.
Right. But my yellow, my experience of yellow is subjective.
Okay, but yellow itself isn't subjective.
Yellow is objective. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so if I say it's yellow, you say it's yellow, Jorge says it's yellow, 1,000 other people say, yep, it's yellow, then we know beyond any reasonable doubt we're dealing with an objective thing known as yellow, and our knowledge of that yellow is, even though it's in the subject, is an objective truth.
Right, but we can never know if my experience of yellow is the same as yours. Even though we know we're experiencing the same thing, we don't know that the experience itself is the same. And that's what I mean is that there are that's what I mean by I say we live our whole lives in our own head, as in like I can make guesses based on my experience as to what your experience might be like, but I can't know that for sure.
Well, again, there's the for sure thing that you're throwing on the end, but
I know I
thought
about it as I was saying it.
Yeah, I think just by good reason, if we're all looking at yellow or we're all looking at a tree and everyone says it's a tree, then there's this thing known as universal. And while, I can't physically get in your head, we can both assume that we have the similar experience when we see a tree, because everyone goes, yep, that's a tree. So right. I don't know why there's any reason to doubt that. It would seem to require greater skepticism to doubt your own experience than just about anything else.
Well, I think there's a lot of times where our experience is worth doubting. I mean, if you remember having small children where you don't get enough sleep, and like for days and days and days you don't sleep properly.
You've got a 2-year-old in the house, John, don't you?
I've got a 3-year-old and a 2-year-old. We had them 17 months apart, and I don't recommend having kids that close together. But if you're super sleep deprived, or if there's psychological problems, like there's many reasons that you could come to doubt your own experience.
Oh yeah, sure. But we're talking when people are in their sound mind. Of course, there are exceptions. But anyway, let's keep moving. We got more questions, and we got 2 minutes to go. So
I'm sorry if we're getting bogged down here.
I got this one, and this is for you, Frank. And James Meeks, through a super chat, asked to know your side of an argument. To know your side of an argument, you have to argue in the opponent's shoes. What do you think is the strongest case for atheism from your perspective, Frank?
To be brutally honest, are good arguments for atheism. I think what atheists do is they have complaints about the way God is running the universe. But I agree with what C.S. Lewis said before. If our minds aren't designed, there's no reason to believe anything we think, including the thought that atheism is true. I think maybe it's better stated this way. What are arguments that give you pause to believe that Christianity is true, not that atheism is true? Okay? And I agree with John that the two arguments that he put forth are evil and divine hiddenness. I think those are probably better arguments against Christianity than any other arguments, but yet Christianity doesn't deny evil or deny hiddenness. It says those things are true. In fact, the whole story of Christianity is solving the problem of evil. That's why Jesus comes, to take evil upon himself. So ultimately, the problem of evil is solved by Christianity, but I agree with John, certainly from an emotional perspective. Certainly going to Uganda and seeing what he has done, or he has seen. Yes, that is emotionally the best argument against God. Ultimately, I don't think it works for the reasons I said earlier, that evil wouldn't even be evil unless good existed, and good wouldn't exist unless God existed, and God has reasons for doing things we don't understand. But I think from a surface level, those are the two arguments. I think John is right. Those are the two main arguments against Christianity.
All right, guys. I do want to. I got a couple of questions here, and I want to just say something what Cranman Photo Cinema said on a super chat. He thank you, John. He says, not trying to put you on the spot, just trying to get you to search your intuitions. If he seems like a dog, why isn't a dog? And he's just making a comment, appreciating that you did answer that difficult question. And then I have my man here, Bam Bamster, speaking Spanish. I'm going to read it out in Spanish because I know a little bit of that. Jorge, un abrazo desde Australia. Gracias a usted y Frank por todo el trabajo que hacen. John here is yellow, and we all are seeing it right now. And he actually did a super chat that is yellow, so he's just pretty much isn't that. It's like, yo, we're seeing yellow. Okay, that's the universal. We all abstract that objective truth from it. But Frank, let's go ahead on. I'm going to give it back to you, and let's ask the last question.
Well, the last question that we always ask, we usually have Christians on, John, so I'll ask the question in a different way.
Yeah, I've been in
the last question is the last question is always, where do we put our hope? And so let me ask you, let's not say there's no God, but let's just say, if you're right that say Christianity isn't true, where do we put our hope?
Dude,
is there hope?
That is the question. And I mean, quite honestly, like I've spent the last few months, 4 or 5 months specifically, reading so much and being motivated by that question. When I hit the realization that I no longer believed in God, it actually sent me into a pretty serious depression for a while, because it was such a foundational thing in my life. And I started going to therapy, and that was helpful. But I still have to approach the question of, how do I orient myself in the world? Why is it that I feel compelled to care about the suffering of other people? Why is that? And why do I feel more fulfilled when I orient myself towards being a part of alleviating suffering in the world? Like, why does that matter to me so much?
Right.
That's part of the reason that I'm still asking questions about God and going okay, like I want hope. I want to believe in goodness in my future and my children's future. I want to know what to teach my kids, and I don't want to be wrong, So these are all the things that motivate me. And one of the things that's become apparent to me recently is that by nature of growing up in church and in Christianity, and also just in the West in general, it's fairly impossible for me to extricate myself from Christianity. There's so much culturally that's built into the way that I see the world and the way that I think and the things that I value. So I don't know. I think for me, hope means trying to get to the bottom of that. And I like what Jordan Peterson says. He lives as though God is real. is that when someone asks Jordan Peterson if he believes in God, he says, "I act as if I do."
Right.
Or I act as if he is real. And I have to notice that about my own behavior. I notice that in very many ways, I continue to act as if God is real. So my hope is that I'm able to get some clarity on that in the future and understand why that is. And why do I value the things that I value? I hope
well,
that
keep seeking, John. I'm glad you're reading. I'm glad you're doing these talks with people, because as I said earlier at the top of the show, a lot of people, they give up on Christianity. They don't want to have anything to do with it. But you seem to be at least searching and trying to discover really what is true. So keep seeking, keep praying, and I think that if Christianity is true, and I think it is, one day you'll be a Christian if you keep seeking.
Hey, I'm going to be on the search for the rest of my life, I think.
All right. Well, that's true. Even Christians are still searching. We still want to know more about God. As 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗕𝗦 said, is the only perpetual novelty. You'll never know enough about an infinite being, right?
Well, and that's one of the things I find encouraging about this is in this process, I've gotten to talk to so many different kinds of people about the ideas surrounding the divine. Mm-hmm. And I've had multiple people tell me like, oh, actually, I've had my faith strengthened in this area. And I'm like, well, I don't totally understand how that works. But if someone comes away from engaging with me in any way and feels encouraged or feels compelled to move their life in a direction that feels healthier or better, like I want to be a part of that.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on, John. Really appreciate it and staying a little longer than normal.
Hey, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been great talking with you. Maybe we can do it again a little bit further down the road.
I'd love that.
And I do want to tell everybody out here who's watching, we're going to have a very special program on Tuesday night. On Tuesday night, rather than Thursday night, we're having Reverend Ar Bernard on from the largest church in the Northeast. It's actually in Brooklyn. It's called Christian Cultural Center. And Dr. Bernard and his son, 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗕𝗦𝗢𝗔, have done some great work in Brooklyn during COVID, and we're going to talk about social justice. Does the Bible actually teach social justice? What is it? And what should we as Christians be doing about it, if anything? So you're not going to want to miss that. It's going to be before the debate. You know, the debate between Trump and Biden is at 9. We're going to talk about this at 7:30 Tuesday night, September 29th. Don't miss it. We're going to be right here, so we'll see you then. Thanks a lot. See you next time. Thanks again, John.
Bye. Thank you, guys.